Hello and welcome to the Japan Information and Culture Center, Embassy of Japan, for this evening's lecture, Samurai at War, Samurai as Patrons, with Dr. Morgan Pitelka. My name is Marina and I am the JICC's Cultural Affairs Coordinator. Before we begin, I'd like to extend a sincere thank you to our guest, Pitelka Sensei, as well as to the JICC team for making this evening possible. A quick reminder, please take a moment to silence your cell phones, and we kindly ask that you hold any questions until the end of the program. We will have time for a question and answer session following the talk. Thank you all for attending this evening's event. I'd now like to introduce the Embassy of Japan's First Secretary, Tomoko Nakamura.
Good evening, my name is Tomoko Nakamura from Embassy of Japan, and it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the Japan Information Culture Center for tonight's talk, Samurai at War, Samurai as Patrons with Dr. Morgan Pitelka. In Japan, samurai have long stood at the heart of historical dramas, from year-long Taiga series to countless jidaigeki productions. Their enduring presence reflects both a popular fascination and a pursuit of authenticity that continues to resonate with our audience. Recently, this fascination has extended beyond Japan, with productions like the FX Hulu miniseries Shōgun, sparking renewed global interest. Tonight, we move beyond dramatization to consider the samurai more deeply, as warriors, as cultural figures, and as patrons of the art. We are honored to welcome Dr. Pitelka, a leading scholar of Japanese history and culture. I first met him through his work with the Japan Foundation's American Advisory Committee, though I had admired his scholarship long before then. Over the years, I have encountered numerous Japanese studies scholars who have benefited from his mentorship, and I count myself as among his fans. His deep knowledge and passion for both history and the arts make us especially excited to hear his insights on the samurai, especially as we eagerly await the next season of Shōgun. In honor of another of Pitelka Sensei's specialties, or passion and areas of expertise, Japanese tea culture, we invite you to stay after the lecture to enjoy a cup of green tea, courtesy of teaism. Once again, thank you very much for joining us tonight, and please join me in welcoming our guest, Pitelka Sensei.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. It's really exciting to talk to a room of people who are interested in the history of the samurai. I'm going to go ahead and get started because I have a huge amount of ground to cover. I want to try and talk about the history of the samurai, but also the complicated relationship between war and culture that I think defines the samurai as an important population in Japanese history. In the world we live in today, we tend to deal with war and culture separately. In universities, in academia, scholars who study war might be in military history, they might study political history. Scholars who look at cultural patronage might call themselves art historians or cultural historians. But in the history of the samurai, these two practices, these two spheres, are so fundamentally linked that I think it's inadequate to leave them to different categories of researchers. And I think we can have a richer understanding, a better understanding of the significance, but maybe also some of the misunderstandings of the samurai when we try and put those two realms together. The history of the samurai is very long. They originated in the Heian period, which is Japan's classical age. They were essentially provincial constables. They were relatives of the aristocrats and courtiers who lived in Kyoto, who were assigned to the countryside, where they engaged in police duties, they fought bandits, they collected taxes, And over time, in the late Heian period, they developed a distinctive martial culture. A lot of what we think of today as sort of the code of the samurai originated in those provincial families who lived over many generations away from the capital city in Kyoto and developed a culture that was their own, that was different from their cosmopolitan urban cousins in Heian Kyoto. Eventually, at the end of the Heian period, the samurai were summoned into Kyoto to get involved in national politics and ended up fighting a war called the Genpei War that the Minamoto family, the warrior family known as the Minamoto, won. And as a result of their victory, they were essentially given the opportunity to found a military government for the first time in Japanese history. And that was the Kamakura Shogunate. The word shogunate is a made-up word in English that is basically a government led by the shogun. And the word shogun literally means essentially general. And what's really interesting here is that the shogun was appointed by the emperor. So what we have during the Kamakura period is two governments. The imperial court continues to exist in Kyoto. You know that there is an emperor in Japan today, and that's essentially the same monarchy, the same lineage, with some complications going back into distant time. And that government continued to exist. But because of the rise of the samurai, because of this powerful military that had Japan, in a way, on its knees, they won the right to form a military government that would be based in eastern Japan, in the city of Kamakura, which is south of present-day Tokyo. So in the Kamakura period, you have these two institutions that cooperate, but are also, in a sense, rivals. And not surprisingly, the Kamakura shogunate was stronger in eastern Japan. The imperial court was stronger in western Japan. Over time, the networks of the samurai grew stronger, and eventually they came to be truly a national force. But in some ways, this resembles the decentralized culture of medieval Europe, where you have different kingdoms, you have the Vatican, you have different centers of power, and that's one of the reasons that we call the Kamakura period a medieval era, even though obviously this is not Europe, it's Japan. But there are enough similarities that that term is useful. Now, one of the distinctive characteristics of this first samurai government that I want to call your attention to is that the samurai from their origin were not only warriors. They were, as I said before, the cousins of the aristocrats and nobles in Kyoto. They considered themselves also to be men of culture. And some of them had distinguished lineages that connected back to the famous aristocratic families in Kyoto. So the idea that this is only a military population has never been true of the samurai. They always have had those elite aristocratic origins. Although obviously the farther you go down in an army, the closer you get to the foot soldiers, the less cultured, the less well-educated the soldiers are. Another characteristic of the Kamakura government, the Kamakura shogunate, is that they were avid patrons of religious institutions. Patronizing Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines had long been one of the key techniques that the imperial court used to solidify its power in the cultural realm and to communicate to the people of Japan that it was not only a secular authority, but a kind of sacred authority. And the Kamakura shogunate followed this pattern. So what we see on the screen here is one of the most famous monuments in Japan today, the Great Buddha at Kamakura. And this bronze statue, which is now outdoors, was once inside of a Buddhist temple. But the Buddhist temple was destroyed in storms and in a tsunami. And eventually the statue was left to be an outdoor monument. This is from a school of Buddhism called Pure Land, which spread in influence and power in the Kamakura period was popular among the peasants, the majority of the population of Japan, but also made inroads with the samurai. The city of Kamakura was also famous in this time for having many Zen Buddhist temples. Zen is, of course, the meditation school of Buddhism, and it spread across Japan during this same Kamakura era, partially through the funding and patronage of this new warrior government. So the first stage, in a sense, in understanding the samurai's commitment to cultural patronage is to understand that this was a political tool, a tool of government, and also was modeled very closely on the activities of the imperial court. One of the questions my students often ask is, why didn't the samurai simply replace the imperial court? Why didn't they just get rid of the imperial family and start a new dynasty, as happened many times in China, in India, in many great civilizations around the world? And there's no definitive answer, but in borrowing and even copying the political and cultural practices of the imperial court, the shogunate ended up simultaneously borrowing the power of the court, but also acknowledging the imperial court as the source of legitimacy in Japanese politics. And that never changed. It's a really fascinating characteristic of Japanese history that this warrior class, which was very prone to violence, they were experts in war, didn't eliminate the one authority above them, the imperial court. Now, I don't have time to go into all the details I'd like to go into, but at the end of the Kamakura period, an emperor came to power in Kyoto who was unhappy with this arrangement. He wanted the imperial court to be sovereign, to have true ruling authority in Japan, and not to rule through the shogunate. So he rebelled, essentially, against warrior rule. And he only could rebel with the assistance of warriors, because he needed to fight the Kamakura shogunate. To do that, he needed warriors on his side. And not surprisingly, the general who came to his assistance and destroyed the Kamakura shogunate then betrayed the emperor and established the second warrior government in Japanese history, which is called the Ashikaga shogunate. There are only 3 of these governments in all of Japanese history, 3 shogunates. So please don't think, oh my God, we're already on the second one. We're going to get to 10 or 12 soon. Only 3, so it's pretty straightforward. The Ashikaga shogunate was not located in eastern Japan, like the Kamakura government had been, because that allowed the warrior class to lose track of what was happening in Kyoto, to lose track of the scheming and the political activity of the emperor. So the Ashikaga shogunate was founded in Kyoto. And this is a turning point in the history of the samurai, because now, instead of distancing themselves from the traditions and cultural practices of the imperial court, the shogun and the generals who served him were in the same city as the imperial court. They could call upon the merchants, the artisans, the temple priests, the traditional cultural recipients of patronage of the imperial court, and the shogunate could patronize them directly. And so a kind of rivalry emerged in Kyoto in the patronage of the arts, with the shogunate now vying with the emperor and his court to be the best cultural patron. And this even extends to the realm of choosing where to build structures. The Ashikaga shogunate would deliberately choose to build their palaces on the sites of former imperial palaces, to sort of steal the good karma of that location from the imperial court. There was a lot of political maneuvering. Again, you might ask, why not just eliminate the court? It was seen, I think, as a cultural impossibility in pre-modern Japan to consider defying the emperor's line with violence openly, but stealing some of their good karma, I think, was allowed. Now, the most influential shogun of the Ashikaga shogunate, the second military government, was the man you see on the screen, Ashikaga Yoshimitsu. He was innovative in many different realms. There were a number of political crises at the beginning of the Ashikaga period that he solved. I won't go into the details. He wanted to open up trade with China, but China demanded that trading nations take part in the tributary system. And no one before him had been able to figure out, how do we take part in the tributary system when we have our own emperor? And he came up with a solution to that problem, and the trade flowed between China and Japan under his rule and afterward. It is perhaps in the realm of culture, however, in which he was the most successful. And I would like to argue that it is the innovations of the Ashikaga shoguns, the rulers of this second military government, that had the biggest impact on Japanese culture in the long term. So the Ashikaga shoguns lived in Kyoto, and they had a palace that was known as Hana no Gosho, the Palace of Flowers, located on Muromachi Street. You can still visit Muromachi Street today in Kyoto. And this was the center for cultural production and political activity in the city, in the way that in the past, the imperial court had been the center. And so all of the buildings that we see in this painted representation of the Palace of Flowers, some are residential buildings, but some are these configurable social spaces where you can change the arrangement of doors, you can have folding screens, you can open and close sliding windows to bring the garden in or separate the inside from the outside, and host banquets, poetry salons, tea gatherings, visitation ceremonies. And all of these rituals that I like to call samurai sociability were the heart of how this Ashikaga government ruled effectively. Not for as long as it hoped, but for several generations. And various artistic, artisanal ateliers, workshops in the city were painting paintings, providing imported Chinese ceramics, building new buildings onto these palatial structures. So it wasn't just the Ashikaga shogunate that thrived under the patronage of the shogun. It was the larger landscape of what we today would call arts and crafts in the city. Unfortunately, the Palace of Flowers is no more. But perhaps the most famous building in Japan, which is usually called the Temple of the Golden Pavilion, or Kinkakuji, still exists, in a sense, in Kyoto, and is one of the most important tourist destinations in the city. And this was originally built as part of a palace complex by Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the shogun who I've been talking about, as a place for him to engage in the politics of culture, in this activity, samurai sociability. This building is quite unique in that each level is in a different style, with the bottom level in the style of an aristocratic palace, the middle level, which is covered in gold foil, in the style of a warrior palace, and the top level in the style of a Chinese Buddhist temple. And this gestures very explicitly all of the sources of authority that the samurai in the Ashikaga period, especially the most elite samurai like the shogun, were drawing upon in their patronage to buttress their authority, to communicate their right to rule, and to cement the relationships that kept these warriors, frankly, from killing each other. You are a provincial warlord who spends part of the year in Kyoto. You're not really happy with the Ashikaga and how they're treating you, but then you get invited to a banquet and poetry salon in the Golden Pavilion. You walk away much more collaborative, much more willing to play ball with the Ashikaga shogun. And Yoshimitsu used this kind of politics extremely successfully. This shogun, on the other hand, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, who is several generations after Yoshimitsu, is famous as one of the greatest cultural patrons, but one of the most inept politicians in all of pre-modern Japanese history. He is perhaps the logical conclusion of relocating the military government to the imperial capital, because he became only a man of culture. He lost track of military strategy, of the tough politics that you had to engage in to reunite a warrior family that had divided, to solve a succession crisis in an aristocratic family, in other words, to rule. He only wanted to rule by hosting tea parties and banquets and poetry salons. And as a result, under his watch in 1467, a civil war erupted in Kyoto called the Onin War, which lasted for 10 years. And then even when it ended in Kyoto, it kind of spilled out of the city into the provinces of Japan. So after that war and after his rule, the Ashikaga shogunate never had real sovereign power as a government again. Instead, the provincial samurai leaders acted independently to protect their own domain, their own lands, their own soldiers. And Japan entered into an extended period of civil war called the Sengoku Jidai, or the Age of Warring States. So clearly, for samurai rule to be effective, there had to be balance. Now, there are great cultural products that are a result of Yoshimasa's inept rule. And perhaps the most visible is Ginkakuji, sometimes called the Silver Pavilion, which he built modeled on the Golden Pavilion. So it's across the Kyoto Basin on the other side of the river from the Golden Pavilion, in the hills, part of a palace complex where he wanted to get up to all the cultural activities that he loved. The Golden Pavilion is a reconstruction, perfect to the inch, but still a modern reconstruction, whereas the Silver Pavilion is the original structure and is a remarkable building to visit. But it is here that many of the cultural activities of the Ashikaga shogunate really truly flowered. And I want to give you some eclectic examples of this. So on the screen, you see a kind of corner of a traditional room from a building that once might have been an Ashikaga palace. And we see some features here that if you've been to Japan, you might recognize. On the left are built-in shelves that have a staggered arrangement. These are called chigaidana, staggered shelves. And they're used in the Ashikaga period to display imported Chinese art. The Ashikaga shoguns, through the trade that Yoshimitsu established with China, collected Chinese ceramics, Chinese metalware, Chinese paintings, and also artworks from other parts of Asia avidly. And they made those artworks the centerpiece of their samurai sociability. So if they hosted a tea salon, they wanted to show off the newest Chinese tea bowls, the newest metalwork, the newest paintings, hanging scrolls with painting and calligraphy that they had acquired. And they even hired specialists, what we might think of as curators, who knew how to handle these artworks, who knew their value, how to arrange them, how to display them. And they wrote manuals that still exist today about the proper display of Chinese ceramics, Chinese paintings. So these shelves actually point to a much broader culture that came out of Ashikaga cultural patronage and politics, including the culture of the tea ceremony, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Now on the right, you'll see this structure that is sort of unfamiliar perhaps in a Western context, but is very common in different forms in traditional Japanese buildings. It's called the tokonoma, sometimes translated as the decorative alcove. And the tokonoma has a raised floor and a lowered roof, and is a site for the display of significant objects. And the typical display would include a hanging scroll, a kakemono, which would have calligraphy or an ink painting, and a flower arrangement in a vase. I think maybe I can point with this. Yeah, there we go. A vase with a flower arrangement. Both of these objects are meant to signal to visitors, to whatever the sociable event is, a theme, a poetic allusion, or a seasonal connection. And this is a form of nonverbal communication that adds meaning to samurai sociability. So you might go to a banquet or a tea gathering in a room like this, see different Chinese ceramics displayed on the staggered shelves, see the seasonally appropriate flower for early September, and see a hanging scroll that maybe talks about the ephemerality of life and the short brilliance of human nature. And so you'd know, okay, this is kind of serious fall. I got to get in the right mood, right? And you can prepare yourself for the gathering. And maybe if you're called upon to offer a poem, you would make a poem, you would write a poem on the spot that alludes to the hanging scroll or engages with the flower arrangement in some way. This kind of nonverbal communication through the tokonoma, through the display of art, becomes after this almost ubiquitous in traditional Japanese culture. I don't mean to imply all of this is invented by the samurai in the Ashikaga period. Some of this is borrowed from courtly practices. But the form that it takes here endures. And even in modern hotels in Tokyo, sometimes I will encounter a funky tokonoma. And I think back to the Ashikaga shoguns and wonder what they would make of it. I once lived with a Japanese family outside of Kyoto who stored their TV in the tokonoma, which was pretty typical, if not very traditional. One of the cultural practices that came out of this Ashikaga shogunal, sociability is known to us today as chanoyu, or the tea ceremony. And this is not always associated with the warrior class. Later, famous practitioners of tea were mostly urban commoners. They were merchants, they were artisans, and I think there's a tendency to erase the reality that this culture originated in the halls of the Ashikaga shogunate, and that the great collectors of Chinese artworks that formed the masterpieces that all tea practitioners in the 16th century lusted after were samurai is too easily forgotten. It is not a practice that on its surface has any obvious connection to war. But what a warlord would do is, after a terrible battle where some of his generals were killed, many soldiers lost their lives, is he would invite the most meritorious, accomplished soldiers to a tea gathering. It was an act of healing. And he would gift the generals who had killed the most men sometimes a new castle, sometimes more land, sometimes, and this is not a joke, there are records of this from the reign of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a tea bowl that he considered to be priceless. And within samurai culture, there was great value placed on both the practice of tea and the acquisition of artworks to be used in the tea ceremony. Another traditional practice that comes out of this Ashikaga tradition of cultural patronage is the no theater. No is often spelled in English with an H at the end. And the no theater originated as a way of performing for the gods. Theatrical troupes would roam different parts of Japan and put on performances at Shinto shrines to call the attention of the deities and bring good luck for the harvest or for the new year. But Ashikaga Yoshimitsu loved these performances and patronized one particular no troupe so that it became a kind of elite performing art tradition. And after Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, every samurai administration up until the modern era invested money in building no theaters, in commissioning new no plays, and in arranging no performances that were like tea ceremonies, like banquets, like poetry salons, opportunities for healing, right? Opportunities for warrior society to remake itself after conflict. In addition, many no plays are based on one of the most important pieces of classical literature in Japan, the tales of the Heike Monogatari. And that piece of literature is about the first great war between samurai clans, the Genpei War that led to the establishment of the Kamakura shogunate. And many of the no plays are nostalgic, mournful recollections of the loss of life in war, the unfair death of a teenage soldier who was a beautiful flute player and shouldn't have died so young, the mother who mourns the loss of her son. And so through the patronage of this theatrical form, the samurai could think about their heritage, to use a word that's very much part of our contemporary American vocabulary, right? They could think about loss, but they could also romanticize their own activities, their own history, in ways that I think, again, helped them to make sense of the world they lived in, because it gave it a history, a literary history, a beautiful poetic history that they could consume by going to the theater. Now, I haven't talked very much about war, and all during this period, the samurai are, of course, fierce fighters, and some of the most effective soldiers probably in the pre-modern world. The samurai who came from elite families prioritized fighting on horseback using bow and arrow. It was considered an elegant art with a high floor and a very high ceiling. And the best warriors could ride their horses down from the hills into a valley, shooting arrows as they rode, steering the horse with their knee. And then if they got knocked off the horse by some poor foot soldier with a pike, they'd get up, unsheath their sword, and fight in hand-to-hand combat. This particular painting shows us on multiple screens that could be unfolded to act as a kind of piece of furniture in a palace, a famous battle from the 1570s in which Oda Nobunaga, one of the great warlords who began the process of unifying Japan, fought against the Takeda, one of the most frightening warlord names in all of Japanese history. And it's famous today among military historians because it's believed that guns that had originally been imported from the Portuguese, arquebuses, were used for the first time in volley fire, where you have a line of gunners who shoot their guns and then step back, and another line of gunners steps forward, ready to shoot, while the first line reloads. I don't think we really know for sure that that happened at this battle, or that this was the first time that that happened in Japan, let alone in the world. But it's a reminder that the samurai were not only experts at riding horses and at archery and at swinging their swords, but in fact would use just about any weapon they could get their hands on and be quite deadly with it. And I want to talk now about a little bit of a grisly part of samurai history that is often overlooked. Please forgive me, it's not too bad, but that's the taking of heads. I think it's really important to understand that there was a performative dimension to warfare in pre-modern Japan. Samurai would often call out their names as they were riding into battle or approaching an enemy combatant, and sometimes they would even recite their family history. They might share a poem or two. And so taking the head of an accomplished, named samurai enemy needed to be recorded. They didn't have iPhones, so they cut off the head of their defeated opponent. And this is called decollation. Headhunting is practiced in many cultures in the world, but people don't know that in samurai culture, it was ubiquitous. It was required. And the reason is that at the end of the battle, as we can see here on the right, the general in charge would have his men bring out a stool, and he would sit down to rest his weary bones after a day on the battlefield. and all of his men would come forward to display the heads of the soldiers on the enemy side they had killed. And they would be rewarded commensurately. So you only took one head, I only have one table for you. You took 10 heads, you get a whole new province to rule, right? This was a form of performance review for the labor of waging war. Now this means that there was lots of sketchy activity. Some samurai would scurry around the battlefield, finding dead enemies who they did not kill and cutting off their heads. Others would send their pages, their squires, to cut the heads off of men while they were engaging in proper hand-to-hand combat. And there are lawsuits, there are documentary paper trails of samurai litigating after the fact stolen valor. You know, so-and-so across the valley claims that he defeated this high-ranking samurai. That was me, and I have 2 witnesses. And here's their signed affidavits. So some of samurai culture is about honor, some of samurai culture is about bravery, but these are very much human beings who want to be rewarded even for actions they didn't actually engage in. But part of what I find interesting about this is that we see here the interest in display, right? The display of Chinese ceramics in those Ashikaga palaces helped give birth to the tea ceremony. What does the display of heads in the late medieval period in the civil wars give birth to? We'll get to that. So one of the most prodigious cultural patrons in all of Japanese history is a warlord known as Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Toyotomi Hideyoshi came from a pretty lowly origin. His father was a peasant warrior who fought in the lower ranks of the medieval armies. But he rose through the ranks. He was a genius on and off the battlefield and became one of the most trusted generals of Oda Nobunaga. And when Oda Nobunaga was assassinated, Hideyoshi managed to take over. He succeeded in reunifying Japan after a century of civil war. And because perhaps of his lowly origins, he was so determined to prove himself in every realm. He was a devoted student in the imperial court. He studied poetry, he learned rituals, and he rose up through the ranks of the imperial court. He was a devoted student of the tea ceremony. He loved the No theater, and he commissioned new plays by No playwrights, including a play called Hideyoshi, starring Hideyoshi, in which he once played the actual starring role. And he was a kind of almost Baroque, sort of gaudy man in his ostentatious pursuit of power, but he also successfully reunified Japan in an era of disunity. A wonderful symbol of his particular form of cultural patronage is the golden tea room that he had constructed. Now, the use of gold foil is quite common in Japanese arts and crafts. We've already seen Kinkakuji, right, the golden pavilion, which has gold foil on 2 of the levels. It's used in architecture. It often seems to imply a numinous, sacred meaning in a structure or building. So it's not unheard of to use gold in an architectural context. But the culture of the tea ceremony in the late 16th century was drifting towards rusticity, simplicity, even a love of old asymmetrical things. And Hideyoshi said, nope, I want a golden tea room that I can take with me anywhere I go to prove that I have the biggest, best collection of tea utensils in the land. And he really had that kind of politics. He famously organized a huge tea gathering. Tea ceremonies usually involve a few people. They're intimate, they're quiet, they're not about showing off. So Hideyoshi, of course, said, I will do the opposite. And he invited all of the tea practitioners in Japan to come to Kitano Shrine in Kyoto, actually threatened them with death if they didn't come, to be honest, and then said, for 7 days, we will just engage in Chanoyu. And at the very heart of it all, I'll display my collection of art. Everyone can see that I have the biggest, bestest collection. I am the most amazing collector of tea utensils in the land. And what happened is quite fascinating. A number of eccentric, quirky tea practitioners who like to improvise with new found objects and create little huts out of nothing, who had a very different aesthetic, captured the attention of the attendees. And so the long lines to be served tea weren't at his biggest, bestest booth. They were all at the eccentric wabi tea men's eccentric huts. So he canceled the whole thing after one day. This is very well documented. I know it sounds crazy, but, and he never did it again. That was it. But for him, being the unrivaled ruler of Japan was not enough. He needed to display his wealth and his power to the general public, it seems, in ways that I find surprising. Perhaps he cared because those were where his roots were. Hideyoshi was succeeded, complicated story, but, well, in the Shōgun miniseries, if you've seen that, Hideyoshi is the Taiko-sama who dies in the beginning. And Tokugawa Ieyasu, the next and third of the three unifiers, is the shogun, the titular shogun of the series, Toranaga-san. Tokugawa Ieyasu was much less ostentatious than Hideyoshi. And he actually didn't seem to be particularly passionate about any of the arts, any of the practices that had mesmerized the warlords and shoguns who came before him. He received permission from the court in 1603 to establish the third and final warrior government in Japanese history, the Tokugawa shogunate. He moved the capital back to the east, the political capital at least, in Edo, his headquarters. Edo today we know as Tokyo. The one exception, the one thing that he seems to really have felt passion about in the realm of cultural patronage was falconry. And maybe it's no accident that it's a sport that involves going out in the countryside, exercising your mind and your body, and watching powerful animals kill other animals. I think Ieyasu saw something of the samurai in the falcons and hawks and eagles that he collected. He amassed a massive collection of birds, and he had a staff of many dozens of falcon handlers who took care of these birds for him. But even here, we see the influence of the imperial court, because falconry was originally the sole prerogative of the imperial court. But the samurai gradually appropriated that practice from the court. It became illegal for anyone other than the samurai to engage in falconry, and they set aside huge tracts of land for the practice of hawking and falconry during the Tokugawa period that endured right up until the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate in 1868. There are records of peasants, upon hearing of the collapse of the Tokugawa shogunate, march into these amazing forests filled with mushrooms and firewood and all kinds of goodies that had signs saying no one but the Tokugawa shoguns can enter here, and tearing them down and going in to make use of the land as they had always wanted to do. So this is one little window into the passion of Tokugawa Ieyasu, at least. Now, the Tokugawa period is a unique age in Japanese history because it is an age of peace that lasts for more than 250 years. This is an era, of course, between 1603 and 1868 when there are revolutions, civil wars, global conflicts even erupting in other parts of the world. But Japan, in relative isolation, is peaceful for this period, ruled by a military dictatorship. The threat of violence was there. But there were not wars for the samurai to fight during this period. So these samurai sociability practices became a kind of substitute. Many warriors devoted themselves with even more of a commitment than they had in the past to the practice of tea, the study of poetry, the commissioning of new paintings, the decoration of castles or residences. And culture became the new battlefield for the samurai to compete on. The tea ceremony absolutely flowered and spread across Japan as an incredibly important practice, not just among the samurai, but among commoners as well. But one of the areas that the samurai had a monopoly on was the ownership and indeed display of the accoutrement of the samurai. Suits of armor no longer needed to be worn into battle, but they could be collected and preserved and displayed in the home as a way of showcasing your heritage. So this, for example, is a suit of armor that had once been owned by Ishida Mitsunari, who was the leader of the army that tried unsuccessfully to defeat Tokugawa Ieyasu. So for the later owners of this suit of armor, they could non-verbally tell a story about their past and their connection to Ishida Mitsunari simply by the display of this armor in a banqueting hall or in a kusarinoma, a kind of reception room during a warrior gathering or a warrior banquet. It became a new way to signal the samurai's relationship to history and heritage now in an age of peace. So these suits of armor that we think of as obviously amazing works of craftsmanship, but also as functional tools to protect the body from swords and arrows and spears, they became objects of display. Their meaning really changed. Something similar happens to swords. So swords in the medieval period were used for hand-to-hand combat, but they were also used to cut off heads, right? As I showed with those grisly images. Not in the Tokugawa period. Samurai, in theory, had the right to strike down someone who insulted them, but there, in fact, was pretty strict policing against unprovoked violence. So samurai couldn't, in fact, go around cutting people's heads off willy-nilly. Instead, swords were given as gifts. So we find lots of records of, let's say, two samurai families who are arranging a marriage, giving swords, even treasured heirloom swords, as part of the deal. Swords were also displayed on racks in banqueting halls, in antechambers, in various semi-public contexts to tell stories about history, about family heritage. So these deadly weapons that used to be worn into battle became symbols. I should also mention, of course, that only the samurai were allowed in the Tokugawa period to wear the daisho, the two swords, a kind of long sword and a shorter sword. And so in woodblock prints, you can tell who is supposed to be a samurai by the presence of these two swords. But they didn't use them, right? They are symbols of a past that is now fading. So a lot of samurai culture in the Tokugawa period becomes about the performance of samurai identity. Every year, the major warlords of the Japanese islands had to spend part of the year in Edo under the watchful eye of the shogunate, and part of the year back in their home domains, ruling their lands. And they would always travel in these huge processions that were very expensive to outfit, and that had to march in formation when they were traveling through villages and towns. They often would carry guns or spears. They had colorful outfits. So this too represents a kind of competition among rival clans, rival families of warlords during an era when they could not meet on the battlefield. So the culture of war has morphed in the Edo period to a culture of performance and display. Finally, I want to mention that the Tokugawa knew that they were, sort of the emperor behind the curtain, right? That they were running this elaborate play where everyone was performing the role of being a samurai, even though they were no longer proving their merit on the battlefield. And so they used various techniques to keep the play going. One of the techniques is that Tokugawa Ieyasu, the founder of the shogunate, was deified and became a very important god who samurai and many commoners worshipped at shrines called Toshogu. The most famous Toshogu is at Mount Nikko, but there, in fact, were Toshogu built all across Japan in many cities and towns for a warlord who wanted to curry favor with the Tokugawa, maybe to ask permission to build a new bridge or something. Build a Toshogu. Show that you are on the Tokugawa's side, right? So that kind of politics was happening regularly throughout the Tokugawa era. But they also sent inspectors around the provinces and domains of Japan to check and make sure that everyone was acknowledging Tokugawa superiority. It was a police state. What's really interesting about these inspectors is they knew that as soon as they left town, no one cared about Tokugawa authority anymore. But as long as they were willing to perform their kind of kowtowing to the shogunate while the inspector was present, as long as the play continued, everything was okay. Until the 1850s, when foreign ships started to arrive, when America demanded Japan open its doors to trade, when internal pressures like peasant revolts started to grow larger and larger, and eventually the Tokugawa shogunate fell in 1868. And over the course of about a decade after that, the samurai class was gradually dismantled and abolished. They did that very incrementally, very carefully, because they knew it could erupt. I don't have time to go into those details, but by the end of the 19th century, the samurai really only existed in history and had already become part of the imagined past of the Japanese. Now, today, of course, we have lots of wonderful imagined versions of the samurai, but I want to call your attention to one you might not be aware of. In the 1980s, a descendant of Tokugawa Ieyasu named Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who was the head of a museum in Nagoya called the Tokugawa Art Museum, one of my favorite museums in Japan, created with the museum a big exhibition that traveled all around North America about the history of Japan through the samurai. And it was the first really sustained attempt to present to foreigners overseas the narrative of the samurai at the center of Japanese history through art and culture. And in this exhibition, Yoshinobu makes the argument that the samurai weren't really those brutal warriors you heard about during World War II. They were patrons of the arts. They loved culture like you and me, right? So this was part of a 1980s Japan that had reemerged as a global power in the economic field, that was a powerhouse that some Americans felt threatened by. It was an attempt to say, don't feel threatened by us. We're not the warriors you think you knew. We are men of culture. It's very explicit. You can just read the prologue to the whole catalog, and he lays it all out. It's fascinating. I'm trying to make a different argument than that. I'm trying to make an argument that war and cultural patronage were fundamentally linked, at least until the Tokugawa period, when the war part took a back seat because Japan was at peace. Now, we also, of course, have just 2 slides left, and then we have time for questions and comments. We also, of course, today have these wonderful historical fiction narratives that are reimagining yet again the history of the samurai. And the Shōgun miniseries, I think, is one of the best that we've seen. It's quite accurate in many ways. The acting is superlative. The set design is astounding. And what this really represents, I think, is the marriage of prestige TV in the West under these streaming services that have come to dominate our lives, and the old tradition that Nakamura-san mentioned of jidaigeki, of historical epics that appeared first in the theater and later on Japanese television. In Japan, you can see great historical epics on TV every year. And Shōgun just represents those stories being brought with some Hollywood magic to Western televisions. Based, of course, here on a novel written by James Clavell in the 1970s. So a wonderful filtering of Japanese cultural and history through multiple layers. But the end result is quite wonderful. We also have these incredibly popular pop culture products that might be a little bit less well known among this audience, but that have just as big of a reach as Shōgun. This video game, which came out this year, is set in the same period as Shōgun, the late 16th century, and is very accurate in many of its details, but is a fantasy video game where impossible things happen. But many, many, many millions of players around the world. By the end of its lifetime, will probably reach 10 million players, shaping historical imagination, shaping our understanding of the samurai, even through fantasy. And I would argue this is not that different in certain ways from Shōgun. So I hope this has given you some food for thought in terms of the history of the samurai. Thanks so much. I look forward to your questions and comments. So we have a roving microphone.
Yes, we do. So I think you got me the first person.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting. My PhD is in history.
Awesome.
And I worked on the Ottoman Janissaries. So and I had these questions of, the modernization, the Western influence and culture in its representations. Like the Ottoman Janissaries valued items like clocks.
Yes.
That came from Europe, other,
Yeah.
items. So you mentioned the volley fire early on, and it's a famous picture, and then some muskets there. And then all the way to 19th century, there wasn't much about Europe and
Yes.
European objects. So is this the story you are telling, or or were there any valued items that came to the samurai culture from the West? Because I haven't seen in the presentation, so I'm very curious. Thank you.
So great question. So the question is about the influence of Europe, let's say, on Japan in the latter period, the third of the governments, the Tokugawa shogunate. There was a period of about a century from around 1540s to 1640s when Europeans were active in Japan, to varying degrees depending on the particular historical moment. But there were Jesuits and later Franciscans trying to convert people to Christianity, working with the Japanese elites to receive permission to build churches. There were Portuguese merchants. There were many, many Chinese merchants, Chinese artisans, Korean ambassadors. It was a very global period. But in the 1640s, even earlier than that, really, it began around 1600, but the Tokugawa started to get nervous about Christianity. And as they came to understand the teachings of Christianity better, the idea that, first of all, there is only a monotheistic faith, and that there is this kind of arbiter of truth in Rome, made them nervous. They also started gathering intelligence about the Spanish activities in the Philippines. They were engaged in trade with New Spain, Mexico, and knew about some of the territorial acquisitions of the Spanish in the New World, and they didn't want to be at the wrong end of that stick. And so I think largely out of a fear, not so much of the ideas of Christianity, but of the other processes that seem to be part of the package, they instituted a very strict policy of border control. So we sometimes call the Tokugawa period a closed country, but that phrase is actually very inaccurate. It was not closed, it was controlled. There were portals that were open to the outside world. There was regular exchange with tribal peoples in the north. There was a diplomatic relationship reestablished with Korea. There were Chinese merchants in Nagasaki, and there were the Dutch, who had a small island that they could live on in Nagasaki, that gave them a portal on the world. The Dutch would travel every year to Edo and tell the shogunate what was happening in other parts of the world. Some Western books did come into Japan in the second half of the Tokugawa period. There was a brief era when restrictions were lifted on non-Christian Western publications. But on the whole, pretty tight border control. And that, it has to be said, allowed Japan to escape or avoid a lot of the really terrible outcomes that a lot of other cultures and nations were experiencing during this age of empire and of imperial expansion. So that's part of why I think we need to study Japanese history. It's a very different narrative than we see in other parts of the world. Thank you for a great question. Yes,
So
sir.
thank you very much for a great talk.
Thank you.
I'd appreciate it if you would unpack the hierarchy a bit more, because you seem to, you briefly mentioned the daimyō, but you
Yes.
seem to throw the daimyō and the samurai in together.
Yes.
Can you distinguish them out? And
Sure.
were Ronin ever
Yeah.
players in
These-
this as well?
So you sometimes can find online diagrams of the social hierarchy in pre-modern Japan. The problem is they're terribly inaccurate because it wasn't really fixed. So I obviously talked about a period ranging from the 12th century to the 19th century. And in different eras, the kind of possibility space varied enormously. In theory, I think you would say the emperor and the imperial family is in this untouchable position at the top. The shogun, appointed by the emperor, is the highest ranking member of the samurai population. Daimyō, who are basically generals or warlords, depending on the era, kind of report to the shogun in a sense. And then each daimyō would have a whole hierarchy of warriors of varying ranks and wealth. You received a stipend for being a samurai that gave you, your annual salary essentially, not in accordance to your labor, but in accordance to your place on that hierarchy. The wealthiest warriors in the Tokugawa period, could support enormous staffs and, had enough money to be what we would today consider to be the 1%, right? Ronin are samurai who served a master who died in battle or was disenfranchised, removed from office, which happened after, for example, the Battle of Sekigahara, and hasn't found a new master. And there are periods of time, like the 17th century, when there are more Ronin wandering. So a lot of the great stories about Ronin are from the 17th century, from that first century of the Tokugawa shogunate. This is a very status-conscious society. So there are these kind of micro-gradations in status between different samurai even. Rank was very important. And you see that, I think, in modern Japanese, for example. Those of you who've studied Japanese, and I'm sure some of you in the audience are fluent in Japanese, know that you always have to be aware of your position socially vis-a-vis the person you're talking to. And you have to engage in a kind of mental calculus. Should I be using really polite Japanese? Should I be speaking kind of bluntly to this person? Should I just keep it safe and just be generically nice, right? And in organizations, you see this play out in all kinds of interesting ways. That, in some sense, is the modern inheritance of this status-conscious hierarchical society, although it's much less fixed today, and some people defy it completely because the rules are eroding away. Thank you. Please. Sorry. Yes, sir.
So thank you so much for this really fun and interesting presentation. My question was about a topic which has obsessed Western audiences for many, many years, which is seppuku.
Yes.
And so I was wondering if you could just speak a bit about the role of ritual suicide in the samurai culture.
Yes, thank you. Great question. The sociologist Ikegami Eiko, who wrote some wonderful books in English about Japanese culture, but has also written books in Japanese, and who studied the samurai, referred to the culture around seppuku, which is the ritualized suicide that samurai did verifiably engage in at certain moments in history. She called that the cult of death. And, it unquestionably existed. When the Shōgun series came out, one reaction that some viewers had, even people who study Japan, is, why is everybody always cutting open their belly in that show? That's so unrealistic. And I have to say, as a historian who studies the 16th and 17th centuries, while it is true that a low-level, mid-level samurai would probably never commit seppuku or even see someone commit seppuku, in the heightened politics of the very end of the 16th century leading into the formation of the Tokugawa shogunate, right? At the end of a century of civil war, The stakes were very high. And there are many, many documented cases of a warlord who could not defend his domain against Toyotomi Hideyoshi's armies invading, and felt the noblest way for me to lose my life is not to die at the hands of Hideyoshi and his soldiers, but to take my own life in the highest room in the castle with my generals around me, and sometimes my family witnessing and then themselves taking part in this act. And it happened again and again and again. Part of it was about this obsession with loyalty. So for example, Tokugawa Ieyasu, when he was young, was the junior kind of ally of Oda Nobunaga, another warlord. And it was discovered that Ieyasu's eldest son was conspiring against Oda Nobunaga. And when Ieyasu found this out, he ordered his son to take his own life. And he did. And if he hadn't done that, there probably never would have been a Tokugawa shogunate, right? I mean, it's a counterfactual, but it saved his relationship with Oda Nobunaga. He was a loyal ally to Nobunaga until Nobunaga died. He then joined Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and eventually he took over all of Japan, right? So there was a calculus, a political calculus, as well as a spiritual belief in a kind of purity of death that seems to have obsessed many samurai. Now, seppuku largely went away for most of the Tokugawa period, and it had a strange reemergence in the modern era after Emperor Meiji, the first modern emperor, died in 1912. Famously, one of his generals committed seppuku, and most people in Japan were horrified. You know, it was like dragging someone out into the public square and beheading them because they, shoplifted or something. People couldn't believe that this grotesque, barbaric practice from the past was back. But it was a sign that that myth of samurai values, I don't mean myth to say that it wasn't true, but that the romantic fantasy about it continued to endure. And it still, every now and then, pops up. So it is an important part of the history of the samurai.
So we'll have time for 3 more questions, but we'll start over here.
Yes. Sir.
Hi. So lately I've been really interested in the Meiji Restoration, and especially like right after that with the Satsuma Rebellion and like all that like crazy like conflict and violence that happened with the Boshin War, Satsuma Rebellion. How did the like imperial government try to like erode the power, cultural and military power of the samurai without making them panic too much?
Yeah, thank you. Wonderful question. So after the Meiji Restoration, Japan had an emperor who was in theory sovereign, but there was a group of oligarchs who were ruling Japan. And they needed to understand the world better because they wanted to be powerful. They wanted Japan to become a great power. They didn't want Japan to be ground under the boot of the West, which was happening in many parts of the world. So some of the oligarchs and many other elites went on a kind of study abroad trip around the world called the Iwakura Mission. They traveled across the Pacific, across the United States, all throughout Europe, through parts of Asia, mostly seeing European colonies, and then eventually coming back to Japan. And one of those leaders, Yamagata Aritomo, one of the oligarchs, studied all throughout the journey modern militaries. And he wanted to understand how militaries worked, what function they played in society. And he quickly realized that the modern military is not only powerful as a tool of offense and defense, but as a way of making modern citizens, right? The problem with the samurai is you don't get to choose who's a samurai. Samurai are born, not made, right? Because it's hereditary. It was about 5 to 10% of the population, depending on the period in Japanese history. So he instituted the creation of a modern conscription-based military. And the samurai were not happy. But there was simultaneously a process of removing the privileges of the samurai. So their stipends that they had received every year were gradually converted into bonds so that they were part of the modern financial system. Lower level samurai lost their special status. upper-level samurai were allowed to become modern aristocrats. So a system of nobility modeled on some of the European social class structures was instituted in Japan, and members of the imperial court and the highest-ranking samurai were bundled together as nobles. So sometimes, until the end of World War II, you'll see mention of Baron Yoshida or Marquis Tokugawa. Those guys are members of the modern aristocracy, and it was successful. I mean, the combination of creating a modern military that helped to make every man who was conscripted feel like a Japanese citizen, the disempowerment of the samurai by taking away their stipends, converting them to bonds so they have a stake in the modern financial system, and then giving the most powerful samurai the reward of being part of the nobility. It was just enough that, with the exception of the Satsuma Rebellion that you mentioned, there wasn't really that much resistance. If you think about the great civil wars, of the 19th century, the Meiji Restoration is barely even a blip in terms of the total loss of life, certainly compared to the American Civil War.
Thank you for the presentation. Very insightful talk. I'm curious, you mentioned something about the showcasing of the Chinese art.
Yes.
Could you speak more to how does the shogunate kind of sees itself when it comes to, with its neighbors? Like, because Japan, from my understanding, like places, like you mentioned, the hierarchy is very important. I'm just kind of curious, how does it sees itself hierarchically with its neighbors?
Yeah, wonderful question. So the Ashikaga shogunate that reestablished trade with China was able to make that official by accepting the title King of Japan, which meant that according to the Chinese tributary system, Japan was in an inferior position to the Emperor of China. So they did that with the logic that the shogun is receiving the title King of Japan. The emperor is still supreme. So it was a kind of trick to make the math work, right? And that's because Japan had a strong consciousness of itself as a civilization that was influenced by China, borrowed from China, copied China, but as it chose to, not through a kind of colonial process. And that separation always has been present in Japanese culture. A good example of that is that in the tea ceremony, you often talk about tea utensils, like tea bowls, using 3 different terms. Wamono, which means Japanese thing, karamono, which means Chinese thing, or korai mono, which means Korean thing. So this is long before nationalism as we now understand it existed in East Asia, but there's this cultural conception of belonging and identity that has a very long history in Japan. The Ashikaga were borrowing Chinese culture, in a sense, to buttress their own authority, but they were not Sinophiles. They didn't dress like Chinese, scholar officials. They didn't consider themselves literati. They didn't aspire to speak Chinese. They just liked Chinese stuff. And I think the one moment of aberration is under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, when having conquered Japan, having been the star of his own play, as I said, right, he decided that Japan should invade China via Korea and conquer all of East Asia. And the Imjin War, which unfolded from 1592 to Hideyoshi's death in 1598, was devastating for the Korean people, for the Korean court. The armies of Ming China came and helped to defend Korea as a vassal state of China. And ultimately, Japan withdrew. And actually later, under the Tokugawa, apologized, sent back lots of prisoners of war. Diplomatic relations were reestablished. That sometimes is overlooked. But in that one moment, it did seem Like, instead of ignoring the hierarchy, Japan thought of itself as being higher up on the hierarchy. But I think that was really an aberration. For most of its history, Japan has been happy to do its own thing with imported goodies when necessary and when possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your lecture. I found it very educational.
Speak up, please.
Oh, thank you so much for your lecture. I found it very educational and very insightful.
Thank you.
What effect did Murasaki Shikibu's Genji Monogatari have on samurai culture as a whole? And how did Monogatari affect samurai culture moving forward, although seen as possibly something that is a bit whimsical
Great
and
question.
not realistic? Thank you.
Yeah. So the Tale of Genji, probably the most famous work of literature in all of Japanese history, predates the emergence of the samurai. It's from the Heian period, although while it was being written by a lady-in-waiting at the imperial court, there probably were incipient samurai out in the provinces starting to form this distinctive culture. I would say that on its surface, there's very little connection. And usually we think of imperial culture as this pure thing and samurai culture as this separate thing. But in fact, what happened is that once the Kamakura shogunate and Ashikaga shogunates came to power, they loved the Tale of Genji and the other monogatari, the great epic works of literature, just as much as their aristocratic peers did. And many of the most important works of art related to the Tale of Genji, paintings, hand scrolls, works of calligraphy, are either currently or were in the past in the collections of warlords or shoguns. So they played a role in preserving that heritage and celebrating it. One way to think of traditional Japanese culture as a whole, and forgive me for making a comparison to Europe, is that much as European painters or authors could make reference to Christianity, but could also make reference to Greek and Roman myths, right? They had a kind of shared heritage that they could draw on for visual and literary culture. In Japan, Genji Monogatari, Heike Monogatari, these different epic tales from the courtly and the warrior traditions equally formed the ingredients for all kinds of new cultural productions. I think they're more connected sometimes than we give them credit for, and they should be seen as part of the same corpus in a sense, with a lot of mutual entanglements. Great question. Thank you so much.
And thank you once again, Pitelka Sensei, for tonight's talk.
Thank you so much.
And thank you all for attending tonight, this evening's event, Samurai at War, Samurai as Patrons, with Dr. Morgan Pitelka. We invite you all to stick around and chat and enjoy a cup of green tea. There's various kinds generously provided by Teaism out in the gallery. Also, if you enjoyed this event, a survey will be sent out later this evening, and there are paper surveys in the gallery. Winner, if you have a moment, please complete the survey. It helps ensure that we're able to bring more events and speakers like Pitelka Sensei to you. Thank you once again for attending this evening's event, and we hope you have a wonderful evening.